We're still looking at Standard 8. Today we're going to look at the Vietnam War, which is Standard 8.3. We're going to talk about the development of the war in Vietnam, as well as its impact on the American government and politics. We're going to talk about the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the policies of the Johnson administration, protests and opposition to the war, the role of the media, the policies of the Nixon administration, and then the growing credibility gap that culminated in the Watergate scandal. So to start off with, the Vietnam War provides another issue that split conservatives and liberals in the post-World War II era. Generally, the conservatives favored the war, while liberals did not. The war in Vietnam developed as a result of the Cold War, and it was part of the containment policy that we discussed in Standard 7. The idea was that we wanted to stop the spread of communism or contain it. After World War II, the French attempted to restore their control of Southeast Asia. However, they met with resistance from the nationalist forces, the Viet Minh, who were led by a guy by the name of Ho Chi Minh. Remember, what they really wanted, Ho Chi Minh and his followers, was to be free and to be independent. The one problem, though, Ho Chi Minh is communist. So since the United States doesn't like the idea that he is communist, and they will never agree to a communist taking control because of the containment theory, they are going to help the French try to gain control. Despite the fact, though, America gave aid from both Truman and Eisenhower, and they gave money and weapons, the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. After the French were defeated, the Geneva Accords were signed, and it said that Vietnam would be divided at the 17th parallel until they could decide they could have elections of their own. Claiming that the followers of Ho Chi Minh were communists, directed from Moscow and Beijing, and citing the whole domino theory that if one country falls to communism, all the rest will too, the United States backed an unpopular, corrupt government in South Vietnam. This was containment in the Truman Doctrine. The South Vietnamese government refused to hold the elections that were called for in the Geneva Accords because they knew Ho Chi Minh would win, and the U.S. supported it because we didn't want the communists to come to power in South Vietnam. We didn't want South Vietnam to fall, because if it did, then that would be the domino theory taking place. If one country falls, the rest will too. And then Kennedy, or later Johnson, would then look like they were being soft on communism, like Truman was when China fell. As a result, the Viet Cong were formed as a resistance movement in South Vietnam. So keep it straight, the Viet Minh were the North Vietnamese army, and the Viet Cong was a South Vietnamese rebel force that opposed the South Vietnamese government and supported the North Vietnamese. So mainly the U.S. is fighting the Viet Cong in the South. The U.S. supplies military aid and military advisors, quotes, to the government of South Vietnam. North Vietnam ends up supplying the Viet Cong. The U.S. is determined to contain communism, especially after the failed attempts of the Bay of Pigs. And so Kennedy starts sending more and more advisors to South Vietnam. By advisors, these are really like military people to try to help the Vietnamese government. The South Vietnamese support in the government continued to erode. In fact, the U.S. actually supported a coup, the CIA did, of the leader of South Vietnam, a guy by the name of Diem, and he is assassinated right before Kennedy himself was assassinated. And the problem with the assassination was that the new president was harder controlled than Diem, and problems within the government continued to grow. So it's another one of those examples of the U.S. supporting a government that was bad simply because they were not communist. When President Johnson took office in November 1963, and he continued the policies of Kennedy until the Gulf of Tonkin happens. In 1964, it was believed that an American naval ship was attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, although it's probably been proven that it was very exaggerated and they really weren't attacked. Congress did authorize the Gulf of Tonkin, which allowed the president to use troops. Remember what we said before, Johnson was very scared about being called soft on communism. And so he's worried that if he loses Vietnam, he might lose the next election because people would think that he is soft on communism. Remember the whole effects of the Red Scare in the 1950s. And so since Johnson is allowed to send soldiers, we start sending American troops to Vietnam in large numbers. And by 1967, there are 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. As we become more and more involved in the war, opposition to the war grew over here. Part of the problem was the Vietnam War was seen as a poor man's fight. The draft was seen as being unfair because some young men were granted medical exemptions. They were also given college deferment. So if you went to college, you wouldn't be drafted, or you could enlist in the National Guard to avoid going to Vietnam. So think about that. Who went to college? People who had money. So those with money were able to avoid going to Vietnam, while those who were not able to go to college and not able to afford it had to go to war. And there's a disproportionate number of African Americans that serve. That means there's a large number of African Americans that serve as ground troops compared to what the number in the population is. There have been organizations that formed to oppose McCarthyism and the civil rights movement, and they start turning their attention to the war. Sorry, they didn't oppose the civil rights movement. That's my mistake. And so these organizations start opposing the war, and they start having protests. And some of the returning soldiers even join the protest. And there's some really famous pictures of these protests, and we'll look at them in class. There's some famous music that comes from that. We'll listen to those in class as well. The protests become more provocative. People start burning draft cards, and protesters end up losing public support, and people start to see the protesters as being like hippies. There's a lot of television coverage of the war, and that television coverage is really going to change this war. It's going to be a lot different with people seeing what the actual fighting looks like, and they see what our soldiers are doing over there. It's hard to justify some of the actions that they are doing. One of the really big incidents that happens is in 1968. It's called the Tet Offensive. This is the Vietnamese New Year. The Viet Cong planned a massive attack on all the major cities in South Vietnam on Tet. It looks like it's a surprise attack. It is a surprise attack, but our soldiers did know it was coming. It's actually a major victory for the U.S. After that victory, the Viet Cong really don't have enough power to really do much. But on TV, it looks like the U.S. lost because people were surprised about how they were fighting in the streets of the cities. And a famous reporter like Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam and reported that he had seen the lies and corruption and stalemate in that war, and that it was time for us to get out. And so, really, they lost confidence. The people lost confidence that the government knew what they were doing and that the army would actually be able to win this war. So, what was an actual victory appears to be a defeat. And since everybody has a TV in their household in this time period, that's going to change public perception of this war. The public opposition and a split within the Democratic Party over the war led Johnson not to run for re-election in 1968, and he starts to begin negotiations to end the conflict. However, the conflict does not end. They do not come to a consensus. In fact, I believe they argue for something like 6 months over how big the table is going to be when they're actually meeting in their conference between the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, and us. Richard Nixon ends up being elected president in November 1968, and voters thought that he was going to end the war. However, even Richard Nixon was unable to admit that the war in Vietnam could not be won. So he turns to a new policy, a policy called Vietnamization, which means he's going to turn over more of the war effort to the Vietnamese people. And he says that, but then he also escalates the war effort by extending secret massive bombing campaigns to the countries right beside Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through, which was the supply route from the north to the south. That leads to more and more protests and a massive peace march in Washington. The Nixon administration does end the draft, which is popular because the draft was seen as being very bad, especially like it was a poor man's fight, and he initiates a lottery system, which seems more fair. The protest movement was somewhat calm, but intensified again when American forces invaded Cambodia to close the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that resulting protest actually led to the Kent State Massacre, where college students were protesting at Kent State, and the National Guard fired into the crowd, killing 4 students. Nixon starts opening the dialogue with China in hopes that he would be able to undermine Chinese support for the North Vietnamese. And he follows a policy called détente, which is a really important policy with the Soviet Union, which means he's going to ease tension. That's what détente means. He's going to ease tension with the Soviet Union, hoping that he can split those powerful communist countries from helping Vietnam. And so at the eve of 1972 election, the Nixon administration announced that they had reached an agreement with North Vietnam. American forces were withdrawn, and American prisoners of war were returned home. In 1975, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese, and the war was over. And so the containment policy failed in Southeast Asia because all of Vietnam was communist, and still is to this day. So Vietnam was a massive, massive failure. It's important for you to understand that Vietnam is bigger than just the failed war effort and the fact that 58,000 American soldiers lost their lives. It was also a cultural phenomenon that called into question American values. If you look at the My Lai massacre, which we will in class, you see that American soldiers acted pretty badly. Also, the use of Agent Orange and napalm, fragging, and the heavy use of drugs among the troops, the mistreatment of the returning veterans, and just the fact that the perception is that we lost in Vietnam is really going to cause a lot of problems for a while, cause a lot of distrust in the government. There's also a distrust between generations, between the people and their government. It looks, the Pentagon Papers were released, which were secret documents outlining why Johnson actually got involved in Vietnam. And it didn't necessarily match up to what he initially said was why we got into Vietnam. And so that increases the credibility gap with the government. People don't believe what the government is saying. And then the controversy over Vietnam leads to the Nixon administration to break into the Democratic National Headquarters at Watergate. And that's going to lead to the Watergate scandal and the impeachment hearings and Nixon's resignation. And so it's going to really destroy people's trust in the government. It also affects government power and foreign policy. Congress took action to curb the president's war-making powers with the passage of the War Powers Act. Now the president has to get approval by Congress to send soldiers to war. I think it's within like 48 hours or something. They have to get power from, or they have to get permission from Congress. All that's kind of been curbed a little bit. And then there's the Vietnam syndrome. It's the fear of becoming mired in a prolonged, unpopular war, and that's going to really affect the United States foreign policy for the next several decades. You could argue that kind of the same thing is happening after the Iraq War today, that we're really afraid to get involved in the Middle East. There are problems in the Middle East that maybe in the past we would have gotten involved with in Syria and Egypt, but today we're not getting involved because of that fear of getting involved in this long, prolonged, unpopular war like Vietnam, like Afghanistan, like Iraq. That concludes the Standard 8.3, talking about the major events of Vietnam and how that changes public opinion of the government. Turn in the notes guide and take the video quiz. Thanks.